Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Gwendolyn McEwen. In particular, the early poems, which are sort of collected up here in Volume One, the early years. This is a selection of poems. This is not an exhaustive collection of her early works, but this covers her. This gives selections from her books from 1960, when she published her first volume of poetry, up through 1972. McEwen was a major voice in 20th century Canadian poetry. She was really kind of a central figure particularly in the Toronto art scene, according to the introduction of this book by Margaret Atwood, another incredibly defining Canadian author. So one of the things my sense of it is that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Toronto was not really the place to be if you were a Canadian artist. It really was Montreal where the artistic innovation and the sort of bohemian innovation was going on. And Toronto was regarded as a bit more sort of stodgy and English, almost, in that sort of like stiff upper lip type way. And yet there was this sort of somewhat flourishing small art scene in Toronto, and McEwen was central to that. So a lot of her early work, especially from her collections in the 60s, really has these very strong beat influences. The beat she started in the 50s, right? The decade of the beat poets, the beat authors, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Fairleigh-Getty, people like this. And a lot of the style of beat poetry is about sort of putting together images and sounds that jar in some way. They're sort of expressionistic poems, right? And a lot of McEwen's early work especially has this very expressionistic type feel to it, where it's more about creating an impression on the listener or the reader than it necessarily is about telling a coherent story. But McEwen is also really fascinated, really throughout her career, with antiquity, with the ancient world, and not as much in the sort of like ancient philosophy and like, oh, Socrates, he's my bro and whatnot, but in like ancient mysticism. So by the end of this period, that covered by the early years, by the early 1970s, she's written her novel. What's the name of it? King of Egypt, King of Dreams. Sorry, I was for a second blending that with the name of Naguib Mahfouz's novel about Akhenaten. But King of Egypt, King of Truth. King of Egypt, King of Dreams. I was blending the two titles again. It's this historical fiction novel about Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. But again, she's got like this kind of fascination with the arcane, the occult, with the ancient, with the mystical, runs throughout McEwen's poetry, throughout her writing across the board. So I'm going to read you a few selections, some of the things that I really like out of this collection. And they'll give you a sense of this, especially these first couple of poems will give you a sense really of these sort of beat-influenced poems from her very early work. So the first one I'm going to read for you is called Explodes, for instance. The old rose still moves, the day wired up in red electric, static pins, its risen stem, and through the old slush of tradition drags dirt over the covers of all the books and crooks of crooked houses. Our blood fires them through and explodes, for instance, the critical mesh of gone days, for we are loud and our lung-loud songs call up dead gardens' inverted seed, though a bladdered boy pees, for instance, on the roses. So this is very beat to me. There is a rhythm to it, but it's a sort of irregular jazz-inflected type rhythm. It's not there's not a standard meter, there's not a standard rhyme scheme, but as you read it, there is still clearly a rhythm to it, but it's a rhythm that shifts, that jars, that syncopates in the jazz-inflected terminology of the Beat generation. There's also these elements of sort of challenging tradition, challenging the ways that things have been done in the past. Through the old slush of tradition drags dirt over the covers of all the books in crooks of crooked houses. The slush of tradition, right? This very sort of anti-establishment, sort of almost revolutionary implications, or aesthetically revolutionary. The books in crooks of crooked houses, this sort of challenge to square literature, as it were. And then at the end, we've got, after this sort of opening portion about roses and gardens and things like this, we've got this very abrupt image, though a bladdered boy pees, for instance, on the roses. This very sort of, again, anti-establishment turn right at the end. And I think we get this... we get this sense as well in this next poem I want to read you, The Breakfast. It brings these sort of anti-establishment ideas and this sort of kind of experiment with form. Because if you actually look at the poem on the page, I'm going to try and hold this so you can actually see it. A lot of it is these very long lines, especially in the beginning. And that's very characteristic of someone like Allen Ginsberg, who was one of the major players of beat poetry. Ginsberg loved long lines. He used them all the time. But then things get shorter, especially toward the last stanza, which is, the lines are very much shorter. So there is this sort of experiment in form, this diminishing of the length of lines as it goes on. And there is something aesthetically purposeful about that. Because it shifts the sound. A long line sounds very different than a short line, and you'll see that as I read it. But again, I think that's very much sort of inflected by jazz, of like shifts of rhythm, shifts of speed, things like that. And jazz, of course, was huge for the beats. So, The Breakfast. Under the knuckles of the warlord's sun, how long do we have? How long do we have, you ask, in the vast magenta wastes of the morning world where the bone nut buckles under for war, when the bone intersects as tangents in the district of the sun, centipedes and infidels, snakes and the absence of doves? The breakfast hysteria, perhaps you have felt it, the weight of the food you eat, the end of the meal coming, before you lift the spoon or eat only apples, to improvise an Eden, or forget the end takes place in each step of your function. Look, the spoon is lifted halfway through invisible tables of dangerous logarithms in the abstract morning spaces. Come, come, eat leviathans in the breakfast wastelands. Eat bestiaries and marine zoos and apples and aviaries. By eating the world you may enclose it. Seek simplicities, the fingerprints of the sun only, and the fingernail of the moon duplicating you in your body. The cosmos fits your measuring, has no ending. Place one hand before the sun and make it smaller. Hold the spoon in your hand up to the sky and marvel at its relative size. Comfort yourself with the measures of a momentary breakfast table. Ah, Lord Sun, terrible atomic breakfast, twilight of purple fallout, Ah, last deck of evening cards, dear infidel, the night is indeed difficult. So again, there's these sort of variations in sound. Like, there's a huge difference in the sound of the first line. Under the knuckles of the warlord's son, how long do we have? Versus the first line of the last stanza, ah, Lord's son. They're completely different. Metrically, rhythmically, they don't necessarily belong in the same poem, but it's, again, these sort of experiments with sound. Another one that I want to read to you, again, picks up on this sort of liberatory ethos. This is from slightly later in this period. Let me see if I can find what year it is. So this is from Breakfast for Barbarians, which came out in 1966. So again, we have this sort of liberatory element that's really key in beat poetry and in sort of countercultural poetry throughout the 1960s. And this sort of rebellious element. So you cannot do this. You cannot do this to them. These are my people. I am not speaking of poetry. I am not speaking of art. You cannot do this to them. These are my people. You cannot hack away the horizon in front of their eyes. The tomb articulate will record your doing. I will record it also. This is not art. This is a kind of science, a kind of hobby, a kind of personal vice like coin collecting. It has something to do with horses and signet rings and school trophies. It has something to do with the pride of the loins. It has something to do with good food and music, and something to do with power and dancing. You cannot do this to them. These are my people. And then the last one I want to read to you. This is very much a sort of, it's one that again sort of picks up on this thematic of art, which we just saw in You Cannot Do This. This idea of like, what can art do? What should art do? What are the limits of art? What are its possibilities, etc., etc. Which is artists love this. Poets love this. What can this form do? What does it do? What should it do, etc., etc. There's a big question. There's tons and tons of poems about what poetry can do. There's tons of art and philosophy of art about what art can do, etc., etc. And so this is McEwen picking up on that poem. It is not lost. It is moving forward always, shrewd and huge as thunder, equally dark. Soft paws kiss its continents. It walks between lava avenues. It does not tire. It is not lost. Tell me, how can you lose it? Can you lose the shadow which stalks the sun? It feeds on the mountains. It feeds on seas. It loves you most when you are most alone. Do not deny it. Do not blaspheme it. Do not light matches on the dark of its shores. It will breathe you out. It will recede from you. What is here, what is with you now is yours. So again, none of these poems that I've read you are particularly sort of mystical or occulty, but that is definitely another strain of McEwen's art, her poetic style, her fictional style, her writing style in general. But these early poems throughout the 60s into the early 70s, again, these are very much sort of, she's at the forefront of these movements in Canadian art that are sort of inflected by the countercultural movements that I think are really more prominent in the US than in Canada necessarily. Because the U.S. is involved in the Vietnam War, the civil rights struggle, the women's liberation movement picks up steam in the late 60s, etc., etc. And Canada, of course, was not really involved in Vietnam. They did not have the civil rights movement in the same way. And so the 60s in Canada was slightly different from the 60s in the U.S., but so much culturally bleeds over from the U.S. into Canada. And McEwen sort of picks up on these cues coming out of American culture and brings them into a Canadian context, and especially by the 70s, really starts getting much more. She becomes really interested, I think, in the idea of sort of how Canada fits into this emerging artistic movement. And she, some of her work from the early 70s starts to become more interested in sort of the Canadian, the sort of iconic Canadian landscape of these, the northeastern forests, things like this, the traditions of like the voyageurs, etc., etc. These sorts of Canadian type traditions, and again, she sort of inflects her art, she inflects her understanding of her own country and its sort of cultural imaginary, to use Northrop Frye's term, through her art and through these sort of elements of resistance, these elements of countercultural fascination. So I'm going to read you one more of her poems, and this is from 1972, I think, or a collection published in 72 at least. Really centered, well, not centered necessarily on, but really sort of driven by an interest in Canadian iconography and the Canadian landscape. This is called Dark Pines Underwater. This land like a mirror turns you inward, and you become a forest in a furtive lake. The dark pines of your mind reach downward. You dream in the green of your time. Your memory is a row of sinking pines. Explorer, you tell yourself this is not what you came for, although it is good here and green. You had meant to move with a kind of largeness. You had planned a heavy grace, an anguished dream. But the dark pines of your mind dip deeper, and you are sinking deeper in an elementary world. There is something down there, and you want it told. And so again, I think this, especially at the end, that idea of there is something down there and you want it told, sort of gestures toward McEwen's fascination with the mystical and the occult and things like that. But again, this sort of, the landscape of pines and water is very much a sort of Eastern Canada aesthetic, right? Very much a sort of traditional rural landscape of Canada at the time. And again, inflected through McEwen's distinctive style and voice.